Can you imagine an economic downturn so severe that unemployment, well, it actually rivaled the Great Depression?
It's hard to picture, but that was the reality in the 1890s in America.
Yeah, it really was.
Yeah.
Okay, let's unpack this because that single fact, it just highlights the huge political and economic shifts happening then.
hmm
This wasn't just some minor recession, it was a genuinely transformative time. Powerful new voices, radical ideas, they were really reshaping the country.
Absolutely.
So today, we're diving deep into the politics of the 1890s. We'll look at the legislative fights in Washington, the struggles of farmers, across the country, and those really dramatic elections that set America on a new path.
And we'll be drawing on historical writings from the period. These sources, they give us a window into what was going on, presidential actions, key laws being passed, the rise of these passionate populist movements, and those really intense election battles.
It's quite a story.
It is full of political maneuvering, a lot of economic anxiety, and just ordinary people demanding change.
And for you listening, getting a handle on the 1890s, it gives you such crucial perspective on where many of our ongoing political and economic debates actually started.
That's right. You see how different groups were wrestling with rapid industrialization, big social changes, struggles that honestly still feel relevant today.
So where should we start? Maybe with Benjamin Harrison's presidency.
Yeah, let's begin there. Harrison's term, 1889 to 1893. It kind of sets the stage. And there were some really powerful figures around, especially in the Republican Party.
Oh, absolutely. And maybe the most powerful was Thomas B. Reed, the Speaker of the House.
Czar Reed.
Exactly. They called him Czar Reed. And for good reason. He had this almost unprecedented control over the House. He was really masterful at using parliamentary rules to push the Republican agenda.
And shut down the Democrats.
Pretty much. He made it very hard for them to obstruct.
And that Republican agenda, well, they had this big budget surplus from high tariffs, and they definitely wanted to spend it. That led to the famous billion-dollar Congress.
Right. There was a real push within the party to use that money.
And they did.
Yeah, they certainly did. This era saw some major legislation. First off, the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. We don't need to get bogged down in the legal details, but its main goal was, tackling the growing power of monopolies. Big business.
Then came the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, also in 1890. And this one is really key to understanding the whole bimetallism debate.
Gold and silver backing the currency.
Exactly. And this act basically forced the Treasury to buy a lot more silver each month than they had been.
It was such an interesting political deal, wasn't it?
It really was.
You had these Western silver state guys desperate to boost demand for silver.
Right. Their main product.
And they sort of teamed up with the protectionists in the East. The silver folks agreed to back high tariffs.
And in return, the Eastern Republicans supported the Silver Purchase Bill. Although it's worth noting, the big Eastern financial players weren't exactly thrilled about flooding the market with silver.
Yeah, they weren't keen on inflation.
No. And what's really interesting is that despite what the silver guys hoped for, the act didn't actually cause major inflation. But it did have other big consequences, especially when it came to tariffs.
Which brings us straight to the McKinley Tariff Bill of 1890.
Right. You can kind of see this as the payoff for supporting the Silver Purchase Act.
It massively hiked tariffs. I mean, the highest peacetime levels the country had ever seen. Something like, 48% on average for goods subject to duty?
A huge increase. The idea was to protect American industries. And they also used the surplus for other things, a subsidy for U.S. sugar growers, bigger pensions for Civil War veterans in the GIR.
The Grand Army of the Republic.
Right. And they even cut some internal taxes, like on tobacco, trying to spend down that surplus.
You'd think farmers might like tariffs on imported farm goods, but many felt it was, a hollow gesture.
Yeah, European farmers weren't really competing much anyway.
Exactly. Plus, there were stories about Eastern manufacturers jacking up prices before the tariff even hit. And the Democrats, well, they really hammered away at this, stirring up anti-Republican feeling among farmers.
And that just shows that classic tension, right, between protecting industry and the needs of agriculture, a theme that runs all through American history.
Absolutely. And the backlash against the McKinley tariff was pretty immediate. The 1890 midterms were a disaster for Republicans.
Huge losses. McKinley himself lost his seat. Over 70 other Republicans, too. And importantly, 9 guys linked to the Farmers' Alliances got elected to Congress.
That's a big signal.
It really is. A sign of growing farmer power. And the conversation starting to shift away from tariffs and more towards silver.
And we should probably mention Harrison's Treasury Secretary briefly. He also helped reduce the surplus by bumping up those GAR pensions significantly.
Which was politically smart, kept veterans happy, used up surplus funds, maybe eased some pressure on the tariff issue.
So all this legislative action, these shifting alliances, it really set the stage for the farmer unrest that exploded in the 1890s.
Definitely. That discontent had been simmering for a while, but the 90s saw farmers organizing politically like never before.
Let's talk about those early groups, like the Grange, the National Grange of the Patrons of Husbandry, founded way back in 1867 by Oliver H. Kelly.
Right. The Grange started out mostly focused on community building for farmers. Social stuff, educational events, picnics, lectures, trying to make rural life less isolated.
And it grew fast, didn't it?
Oh yeah, huge growth. By 1875, maybe 800,000 members, mostly in the Midwest and South.
But it didn't stay just social.
No. They moved into economics, setting up cooperatives, buying supplies together, marketing crops collectively, grain elevators, stores, that kind of thing.
And they started pushing back against the railroads, demanding an end to monopolies. Though, interestingly, their own attempt to make harvesting machines failed financially.
Yeah, it didn't work out.
Yeah.
But what is fascinating is how they got into politics.
The Granger Laws.
Exactly. In states like Illinois, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, they pushed for laws to regulate railroad rates and storage fees. The core idea was that businesses serving the public interest, well, they should be regulated by the public.
And the Supreme Court initially agreed, right? Munn versus Illinois in 1877.
That was a big win. The court said states could regulate private property if it was affected with a public interest.
But that didn't last forever.
No. The Grange's influence started to fade. Some laws were maybe poorly written, got overturned, but the bigger blow was the Wabash case in 1886.
What did that decide?
The Supreme Court ruled that individual states couldn't regulate interstate commerce. That power belonged to Congress.
Ah. So that really undercut the state-level Granger laws for railroads crossing state lines.
Exactly. It weakened Munn v. Illinois and really limited what the Grange could achieve politically at the state level.
We also saw that brief flash of the Greenback Labor Party.
Right. Trying to combine inflation printing more greenbacks with pro-labor policies. They actually did pretty well in 1878, got over 1 million votes, sent 14 guys to Congress.
But then fizzled out.
Pretty quickly. By 1880, their presidential candidate, General James B. Weaver.
We'll hear that name again.
We will. He only got about 3% of the vote. But that underlying farmer anger, it didn't go away. It just morphed into something bigger. Populism.
The Populist Party. This really came out of the farmers' alliances, right? In the South and Midwest, there was even a colored alliance.
Yes. And they had similar goals to the Grange. Social events, political action, cooperatives, regulation of railroads and manufacturers. But they grew even larger. By 1889, the main alliances had maybe 3 million members.
Wow.
And they were getting much louder, demanding free coinage of silver and, crucially, the sub-treasury plan.
Yeah.
They also linked up with groups like the Knights of Labor.
Okay, the sub-treasury plan. What exactly was that?
This was a really big deal, especially for the Southern Alliance in the 80s. The idea was for the federal government to set up sub-treasury offices, basically warehouses or grain elevators. Farmers could store their non-perishable crops there, cotton, wheat, corn, and get low-interest government loans for up to 80% of the crop's value.
Ah, I see. So it tackles two problems. The lack of cash flow during the year, and the price crash at harvest time when everyone sells at once.
Precisely. It aimed to give farmers financial breathing room and maybe help stabilize prices by allowing them to hold crops off the market.
Makes sense. But it didn't pass Congress.
No. It was defeated in 1890. And that defeat was a major turning point.
How so?
It convinced a lot of alliance members that they couldn't rely on the existing parties. They needed their own third party. There was just this deep distrust of national banks, the Eastern establishment, this feeling that the people who actually produced things were getting screwed.
And that's how the People's Party, the Populists, were born in the early 90s.
Exactly. It grew out of the alliances, really took off in places like Kansas first,
Yeah.
pulled in alliance members, some former greenbackers, disgruntled white Southerners.
And they had some fiery leaders.
Oh, absolutely. Figures like Ignatius Donnelly, he'd been in Congress, wrote utopian novels. And Mary Elise, what an orator.
Raise less corn and more hell.
That's the famous line. Apparently gave something like 160 speeches in 1890 alone, just railing against Wall Street.
Incredible energy. And sockless Jerry Simpson.
Yep. He and Elise actually traveled south, trying to bridge the gap between white and black farmers, build support for the populist cause there. And Tom Watson from Georgia.
Right, he got elected to Congress in '90, fought hard for the sub-treasury plan, and later he'd be Bryan's populist VP running mate in '96.
But this populist surge was happening at the same time as something really dark in the South.
Yeah, the rise of disenfranchisement and horrific anti-Black violence.
It's a brutal part of the story. Figures like Pitchfork Ben Tillman in South Carolina were central.
He used the Southern Alliance's influence.
Absolutely. He rode that wave to become governor, basically took over the Democratic Party in the state, and then pushed through changes to the state constitution specifically designed to disenfranchise Black voters.
And this wasn't just South Carolina.
No. There was this widespread fear among white Southerners about Black political power within the alliances. That fear was a major driver behind disenfranchisement and the spread of Jim Crow laws across the South in the 1890s. State after state followed South Carolina's example.
But you also mentioned it wasn't just about race.
That's a crucial point. While racism was absolutely central, the push to restrict voting was also a tactic used by the established Southern elite, the New South leaders, to counter the threat from all lower-class voters, white and Black, who might support the populists and challenge their power.
So even some poor white farmers who were racist themselves were being disenfranchised by the same system.
Exactly. They might have shared the racist views, but they still wanted reforms and saw themselves as victims, too, of a system rigged by the elite.
And the violence, the lynchings.
It spiked dramatically in the 1890s. Some historians describe the level of white hatred and violence against Black Americans then as almost genocidal. It was just horrific, a terrifying backdrop for everything else.
So it's against that backdrop that we get the 1892 election.
Right. A really pivotal contest. The Democrats bring back Grover Cleveland. By this point, he's seen as more conservative. His law practice catered to wealthy clients.
And the Republicans renominate the incumbent Harrison, still pushing the protective tariff.
And then you have the populists nominating General James B. Weaver, who we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, the former Greenback candidate.
Their convention was in Omaha, Nebraska. Delegates from the Farmers Alliances, Knights of Labor, even some socialist groups, they all came together to hammer out a platform.
The Omaha Platform. Pretty radical stuff for the time.
Very radical. Ignatius Donnelly wrote most of us. Grew out of the alliances, really took off in places like Kansas first. Pulled in alliance members, some former Greenbackers, disgruntled white Southerners, key demands, free and unlimited coinage of silver at 16-1. That was huge, aimed at inflating the currency.
What else?
A graduated income tax, government ownership of railroads, telephone, telegraph lines, initiative and referendum, so citizens could propose and vote on laws directly.
Wow. Taking power away from legislatures.
Exactly. Also, postal savings banks, safe places for people to deposit money. Limiting land grants to actual settlers, not corporations. Direct election of senators.
Yeah, which we eventually got.
We did. And an 8-hour workday was a really comprehensive vision. Interestingly, the sub-treasury plan wasn't explicitly in there.
Why not? It was so central before.
Partly because it had already been defeated in Congress, and maybe partly because it was seen as more of a Southern alliance thing, and getting full Southern buy-in to the third party was still tricky because of the racial dynamics.
Got it. And Weaver himself, quite a background, abolitionist, Union general.
Yeah, a compelling figure. The campaign itself focused a lot on the tariff, but then you had major labor strikes like the Homestead strike.
Which really hurt the Republicans, right? Hard to argue high tariffs mean high wages when you've got violent strikes at tariff-protected industries.
Exactly. Homestead likely cost Harrison a lot of working-class votes.
So the results. Cleveland wins.
Cleveland wins the presidency, yes. But the populists, they made a serious statement.
How well did Weaver do?
Over 1 million popular votes. 22 electoral votes. That's one of the most successful third-party showings in U.S. history.
Where was their support strongest?
Mostly the West. Kansas, Colorado, Idaho, Nevada. They also elected governors, 5 U.S. senators, 10 representatives, about 1,500 state and local officials overall. Real inroads.
But not in the South, generally.
Not as much as they hoped. As we discussed, those indebted white farmers, even though they shared the economic pain, mostly stuck with the Democrats. Fear of Black political power via the Colored Farmers Alliance was just too strong. That racial divide really hampered the populists in the South.
Okay, so Cleveland's back in office, his second term, 1893 to 1897, and it's immediately dominated by crisis.
The Panic of 1893. Just devastating, often called the worst depression of the 19th century. It hit the cities and industrial areas incredibly hard.
Unemployment skyrocketing.
Yeah, rivaling the Great Depression levels in the winter of 93-94. Thousands of businesses failed, major railroads collapsed. It was chaos.
What caused it? I know the stock market crashed.
That was the immediate trigger, yes. But the underlying causes were deeper. Too much railroad building, maybe on shaky financing, heavy farmer debt, lots of speculation. And European investors started pulling their money out, partly because they were nervous about all the free silver talk in the U.S.
Worried the dollar would be devalued.
Exactly. Plus, you already had labor unrest and the ongoing agricultural depression. It was sort of a perfect storm.
And this hammered government finances too, right? Gold
Yeah.
reserves drop in.
Dramatically. They fell below what was seen as the safe minimum. The government started running a deficit. Part of the problem was this endless chain from the silver purchases.
Explain that again.
Well, the government had to buy silver with special treasury notes, but those notes could then be redeemed for gold. So people would essentially trade silver for notes, then immediately cash the notes in for gold, draining the treasury's gold reserves.
Ouch. So what did Cleveland do?
He felt he had no choice but to push for the repeal of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act.
The very act passed just a few years earlier.
Right. But doing that completely fractured the Democratic Party. Figures like William Jennings Bryan fought tooth and nail against repeal. It alienated the whole silver wing of the party.
And then there was the Morgan Bond deal to shore up the gold reserves.
Yes, by early 1895, the gold reserve was dangerously low, like critically low. People feared the U.S. would be forced off the gold standard entirely.
Which would have caused even more chaos.
Huge chaos. Cleveland tried selling government bonds for gold publicly, but it wasn't enough to stop that endless chain.
So he turned to
J.P. Morgan and a syndicate of private bankers. They cut a deal. The bankers would lend the government $65 million in gold. In return, they got government bonds and a hefty commission, around $7 million.
controversial, I imagine.
Very. But a key part was that the bankers promised to get half the gold from overseas, which helped restore some international confidence, at least for a while.
All this economic pain must have fueled social unrest.
Absolutely. You see things like Coxey's Army in 1894.
The March on Washington.
Yeah. Unemployed workers, led by Jacob Coxey, marching to D.C. to demand government help. They wanted public works programs to create jobs, funded by printing more money.
Coxey himself was an interesting figure, a businessman, but involved in currency reform, populist stuff.
Right. He wasn't just some random guy. He had a specific platform. But when they got to D.C.,
They got arrested for walking on the grass.
basically, yeah,
Yeah.
arrested on minor charges. It showed how unwilling the federal government was to respond directly to the demands for relief.
And that same year, 1894, was the Pullman strike.
Another huge event, led by Eugene V. Debs and the American Railway Union. When it disrupted mail delivery, the Attorney General, Richard Olney, stepped in.
And used an injunction.
First time the federal government used a court injunction to break a major strike. Sent in troops, too. It just deepened the sense among many workers that the government was on the side of capital, not labor.
Meanwhile, back in Congress, the Democrats tried to tackle the tariff again, the Wilson-Gorman bill.
Yeah, the McKinley tariff had led to deficits, so they wanted to lower rates. But the bill got loaded up with amendments in the Senate. Lobbyists had a field day.
So the tariff stayed pretty high.
They did. It was widely seen as a failure for tariff reform. They did stick in a small income tax provision, 2%, on incomes over $4,000, partly to try and appease the populists.
Which the wealthy hated.
Oh, absolutely. Cleveland himself disliked the final bill so much he let it become law without his signature.
And the income tax part didn't even last, did it?
Nope. The Supreme Court struck it down in 1895. Pollock v. Farmers Loan and Trust Co. said it was a direct tax that wasn't properly apportioned by population.
Which must have enraged the populists.
Totally. More proof in their eyes that the courts were in the pocket of big business. And politically, the whole messy tariff fight ended up helping the Republicans, who swept back into control of Congress in the 1894 midterms.
What a mess. And amidst all this little book becomes a huge bestseller.
Cohen's Financial School by William Hope Harvey. Phenomenal success. It was written like a series of lectures by this fictional young financial whiz, Coin Harvey.
And it argued for
Free silver. Made this passionate case that coining silver freely was the answer to everything. Tapped right into public anxiety, pushed conspiracy theories about bankers manipulating the gold standard. It really captured the mood.
So depression, strikes, court battles, silver debates, it all leads up to the election of 1896.
The big one. The showdown.
You've got William McKinley for the Republicans and William Jennings Bryan for the Democrats, who also gets the populist nomination.
Right. And McKinley's campaign is largely run by Marcus Hanna.
The wealthy industrialist, a symbol of big business and politics.
Exactly. Hanna believed government should help business. Prosperity would trickle down. He raised an enormous amount of money for McKinley's campaign. Just unprecedented levels of spending.
What was the Republican platform? Gold standard.
It's officially, yes, gold standard. Though they put in some language about maybe pursuing international bimetallism, which everyone knew was unlikely. And, of course, they praised the protective tariff.
And Bryan. His nomination was a huge shift for the Democrats, wasn't it? Rejecting Cleveland's conservatism.
Completely. Bryan was young, only 36, an incredible orator from Nebraska. He just perfectly channeled the anger and frustration of farmers and workers.
And his Cross of Gold speech at the convention?
Yeah.
Legendary.
Absolutely electrifying. That closing line. You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. It basically won him the nomination on the spot and became the rallying cry for the whole campaign.
And the Democratic platform was all about silver.
Central demand. Free and unlimited coinage of silver at 16 to 1. That was the core economic proposal. 16 ounces of silver legally equal to 1 ounce of gold for coinage.
Which would mean significant inflation.
Yes, that was the point, to help debtors and raise prices.
What about the populists? Did they just fold into the Democrats?
It was a tough decision for them. They agreed with Bryan on silver, obviously, but merging fully meant losing their distinct identity. In the end, they nominated Bryan too, figuring it was better than splitting the silver vote and letting McKinley win. They nominated their own guy, Tom Watson, for VP, though, creating a slightly awkward ticket.
Right. And the gold standard Democrats, the Cleveland loyalists?
They tried to run their own candidate, but it went nowhere. It was really McKinley versus Bryan.
And the campaigns were totally different styles.
Night and day. Bryan traveled thousands of miles, giving hundreds of speeches, this whirlwind tour promoting silver. Hanna, meanwhile, ran this highly organized, well-funded campaign against silver, portraying Bryan as a dangerous radical.
And McKinley.
He mostly stayed home in Canton, Ohio. Ran a front porch campaign. Delegations would come visit him. He'd give calm speeches, aimed at reassuring middle-class voters worried about economic stability.
So the results?
McKinley wins. Decisively, both the Electoral College and the popular vote.
What was the map like?
McKinley swept the Northeast, the industrial Midwest. Bryan carried the South and most of the West, except for California and Oregon. A clear regional split.
And this election is seen as a real turning point.
Huge. Often called the end of the Gilded Age political system. It's seen as the last real attempt to win the White House with mainly agrarian votes. The country's demographics were shifting towards cities.
So a rural base wasn't enough anymore.
Not on its own. It ushered in a long period of Republican dominance, lower voter turnout, what historians call the fourth party system. Urban interests became much more central. Farmer power declined.
And sadly, it also coincided with the Republican Party largely abandoning the fight for black voting rights in the South.
Yeah, with the South solidly Democratic and the North providing enough votes for Republican victories, protecting black voters in the South became less of a political priority for the national GOP. A tragic consequence.
Now, there's that interesting interpretation of The Wizard of Oz as an allegory for all this.
Yes. The theory, popularized by historian Henry Littlefield, suggests L. Frank Baum might have been writing a parable about the 1896 election.
So Dorothy is?
Maybe the average American, perhaps from the West. The yellow brick road is the gold standard, and her slippers in the book, they were silver, not ruby.
So silver, the populist solution. But she doesn't realize their power initially.
Exactly. The scarecrow represents the supposedly brainless but actually wise Midwestern farmers. The Tin Man, the dehumanized industrial workers of the East, needing a heart, maybe oppressed by the wicked witch of the Eastern bankers and industrialists.
And the wizard himself? An OZ, maybe ounce?
Could be the wizard is like the politicians, maybe McKinley, seemingly powerful, but ultimately just ordinary men behind a curtain. The cowardly lion.
Bryan, all roar, but maybe not effective in the end.
That's one interpretation. The Wicked Witch of the West could be the harsh environment or mortgage lenders of the West, defeated by water maybe representing nature, or irrigation, or just the truth washing away illusion. The flying monkeys, maybe Plains Indians, once free, now controlled. It's a fascinating lens to read it through.
It really is. So the Populist Party itself fades after '96.
As a party, yes, pretty much. But their ideas,
Yeah.
that's a different story.
They lived on.
Absolutely. So many populist planks were later picked up by the progressives in the early 20th century and actually became law.
Like what?
Railroad regulation got stronger. We got a federal income tax eventually, a more flexible currency system through the Federal Reserve. direct election of senators, initiative and referendum in many states, postal savings banks. It turns out many of those radical ideas resonated with urban reformers too, not just farmers.
So populism failed as a party, but succeeded in shaping the future agenda.
In many ways, yes.
Okay, so McKinley wins, the gold standard triumphs. What happens in his presidency, domestically?
Well, they passed the Dingley Tariff in 1897, pushing rates even higher. And then the big one for this debate, the Gold Standard Act of 1900.
Making it official.
Completely official. With the civil rights weakened in Congress after '96, the Republicans formally made gold the sole basis for U.S. currency. The bimetallism debate was effectively over.
But didn't inflation eventually happen anyway? The very thing the civil rights wanted.
Ironically, yes, moderate inflation did start to occur, but not because of silver. It was due to a booming global economy and, crucially, huge new gold discoveries. The Klondike in Canada, Alaska, South Africa, Australia.
So more gold flooded the world market.
Exactly. Plus, new technology, like the cyanide process, made it easier to extract gold from ore. So the gold supply increased naturally, easing deflationary pressures and kind of making the whole silver argument less urgent.
Wow, so history sort of solved the problem in its own way, sidelining the populist solution.
In a sense. Though the underlying issues of debt and farmer hardship didn't just vanish overnight.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive into the 1890s, what are the big takeaways for you listening?
Well, we've seen this decade of just intense political fighting over basic economic questions. Who controls the money supply? What's the government's role? We saw the rise and fall of this powerful populist movement.
And how all these events hit different groups in America really differently. Farmers, workers, industrialists, Black Southerners, everyone experienced this era uniquely.
And it's so clear how these debates from over a century ago about money, about government power, about inequality, they really laid the foundation for conversations we're still having today.
Which leads us to a final thought for you. When you look at the economic anxieties of the 1890s, the fear of monopolies, the struggles of ordinary people, the debates over currency, and compare them to challenges today, what lessons can we actually draw from that period?
What does it teach us about how government responds or doesn't respond? About the power and maybe the limits of social movements? About how economic policy shapes real lives?
Or maybe think about this. The Populist Party vanished, but so many of its ideas eventually went mainstream. What does that tell us about how radical thinking can influence the future, even if the original movement itself doesn't last?
Lots to chew on there.
Definitely. We really hope you'll explore this fascinating, turbulent decade further, look at primary sources, read some biographies. Understanding the 1890s genuinely provides valuable context for navigating our own times.